Voices of the West. Today we are joined by G. Wayne Tilman, author of 18 books, including, well, actually it's 28 books, including 18 Westerns and 10 overall thrillers as it goes that way. And you just released a new thriller out through DSP, and we greatly appreciate all of that with A Captive Matter. So welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Kevin. I look forward to our chat.
Absolutely. So what got you into Westerns?
My heritage, basically, it's in my DNA. One of the first sheriffs in the New World was Roger Tilman in 1680, and I am a direct descendant of his, probably 12th great grandfather, as near as I can tell. Coming on down the ladder towards the future, Bill Tilman, who's a fairly well-known frontier lawman. It's a distant cousin. His grandson was a late grandson, just passed away a couple of years ago, was a very dear friend of mine, as are his great-great-grandchildren. And I have one of Bill Tilman's guns in my collection. I'm very proud of that. My great-grandfather, McLaughlin, was a deputy U.S. Marshal. My mother wasn't in law enforcement, but she was a counterintelligence agent with what's now the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that got me started in my career. That was kind of the shove. And so I was a deputy sheriff. And from the standpoint of the book that I have just written, I was also a security contractor and was a private investigator with my own firm for 9 years prior to joining the FBI, from which I recently retired. So it's in the DNA, and we can talk about that more as we get around to it.
Absolutely. Well, considering your background and heritage attached to all of this, you know, you basically read through like an overall spy novel just by itself, just reading your overall bio on everything here. What made you, what about Westerns inspires you?
I grew up before you did, but before a lot of people did, watching Westerns, both the Warner Westerns, Colt 45 and so forth. Actually, do you remember Hugh O'Brien and Wyatt Earp on TV?
Oh, absolutely. I love that.
Hugh O'Brien was a dear friend of mine. He passed away 5 or 6 years ago.
I was part of the Hugh O'Brien Youth Foundation when I was in 10th grade.
I'll be darned. Well, I was a speaker at the Hugh O'Brien Youth Foundation in several locations. What state were you in?
Southern California.
Okay, I didn't make it that far west, but in the East, I spoke at a number of his foundation meetings.
Outstanding.
And somewhat in my defense, I was pretty much the youngest guy there as a speaker, but he was a great guy and a fellow Marine, and we lost touch, sadly, over the last 10 years, and then he passed away. But he was a great man and a decent human being.
Yeah, and played a great Wyatt Earp.
Yeah, he did. He really did. Maybe not the most accurate in the world, but a great one. And he set the pace for Wyatt Earp. I mean, some of the actors that played him up until we got to Tombstone were just, they didn't catch it. They didn't get it. I will say Tombstone, anything I say about movies and authenticity in Westerns on TV and in the movies does not apply to Tombstone, because I think that's pretty much dead on.
Yeah. My personal favorite movie in existence. So
mine too.
A couple hundred times. Yeah. Always a nice thing, but going out to visit Tombstone, watching that the night before just to get ready for it, and yeah, it's always a nice thing.
Yeah. But back to your question, when I was 8 years old, my mother handed me a new Look magazine saying, "You're going to like this. Here's a relative of yours." And it was an article by Zoe Tilman, the second wife of Bill Tilman, who was still alive at that time. And this was in the 50s. And I was just a little guy. And it was about Bill Tilman. And man, that clenched it right there. And even Ronald Reagan on one of the radio shows, Western radio shows, can't remember the name of it, had a Tilman episode. So I started studying him and watching everything I could on TV and reading every book about the West. And I was hook, line, and sinker. I was caught.
Absolutely. Bill Tilman was one of the only, well, I think he's the only real marshal that actually went on to star in his own movies. Well, he
Yes,
made
he did. He did. And I've actually got, it was a 6-reel movie,
Mhm.
Kevin, and I've got one of the reels.
Do
And
you?
I mean, it was like heaven. I got to see my lifelong hero in action, and I wish I could hear his voice. But I did get a recording later, before his death in 1938, I believe, of his friend Chris Madsen. Tilman was one of the three guardsmen of Oklahoma: Bill Tilman, Chris Madsen, and Heck Thomas. And Chris Madsen did a historical series where he talked about the old days and the land rush and so forth. And he had very strong accent, even a Danish accent, even as an old man. He'd been here since he was in his 20s. But that was, and I went actually in Oklahoma to see what was left of Tilman's house and one of his earlier houses when he was a sheriff in one of the small towns. I think it was Guthrie at the time, and to see Madsen's house and Heck Thomas's house. They're still standing, still lived in, not by relatives, but by somebody. And so this has been a lifelong thing. If I had not become a Western author, I think my family would have been amazed. And it took me a long time. My first book was a thriller, and my career at the time kind of fed into thrillers. And most of the adventures, and this may be worth talking about later, most of the adventures and were things that have a relevance to writing any adventure, whether it's Western or spy adventure or whatever. The people I got to know and to talk to, and the things that happened to me. How do you feel in a certain type of instance? How scared are you? How do you describe that fear? Things like that. And I think that it makes for a more authentic book. I hope so.
Indeed. Well, the experience of actually having lived it, to know what things feel like, smell like, look like, all of that just makes a finer piece of fiction when you're writing it.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I got started. And the first book, the first Western, was about Bill Tilman. And I wrote it to be a biography. And I was so naive, I didn't realize I needed 1,000,000 footnotes. And so the University of Oklahoma Press told me, said, "This is great, but you need to send it to a New York author as a historical fiction because we need page after page of footnotes." And I said, I'm not going to do that. So anyway, I did a lot of research, but my research, Kevin, is maybe different. I don't know how other people do research. And I know that all of our authors do scholarly research. You can tell from what they're writing. I do it as a cop. I research a person or a situation just like I'm working a case. And I think that's a different approach than perhaps some more scholarly authors take. I like to go there. I like to talk to people. In the case of Bill Tilman, I talked to 2 elderly gentlemen who had actually met him. One had not only met him, but he was a cousin and had grown up on a cattle ranch. And Tilman visited his ranch. And the thing that impressed him the most of all, of this tall, very handsome older man at the time, was his perfect mustache. That just captured this kid's imagination. But he grew up on a cattle ranch, and he told me what it was like on the ranch. And one of the night Bill Tilman was killed in Cromwell, Oklahoma, at his 70th birthday, on Halloween night at midnight, the town came to the furniture store where he was dying. And one of the people who came there with his family was a little boy who lived in Cromwell and died in Cromwell. I guess if he's alive now, he must be 120, and I hope he is. But he told me about that night and how people felt, and then he told me about other things unrelated, things like how the Seminole Indian light horse police would track people down and how they would punish them, and told me about the hanging tree and the shooting tree. That tree somebody stood against to be shot for capital punishment, and about the drug problems in Cromwell at the time, things like that. That I couldn't research that stuff. I'd never found it before until he told me about it. So that's more to me the cop approach. Go interview people, take notes, try to figure out how it plays into the rest of the case. And maybe that's what all of my peers do too. I don't know. They haven't told me that if they do.
It definitely is a slightly different angle on everything, because I think most people go out there to say like, oh, well, I have to figure out like, what did Dodge City look like at this time? What did they do in there and stuff like that? And they start hitting things up based on the subject instead of trying to necessarily burrow into that level of things.
And
You get a lot greater context that is not going to show up in any written books for that.
in Photo Vault, I've got a whole file of Dodge City, Tombstone, Tucson, Flagstaff, Denver, and of pictures of those places from 1865 to 1905. And I studied it, and I look up street names that were relevant then. And said, okay, he walked out of the marshal's office and got on his horse Bob and rode down Grant Street. Well, Grant Street was really the main street in that town. And the other kind of thing I look for is if the guy's got to go a long ways, I check to see if there's a train, because most of the trains then had stock cars, and he could check his horse into a stock car and ride the train instead of riding 350 miles. He skipped that on TV. And so anyway.
Yeah, by 1880, they had rail networks going basically everywhere, all over the place, particularly the further east you go. So you could catch anything to anywhere.
Yeah. Well, and one last thing on Bill Tilman, I'll shut up about him.
Oh, don't need to do that.
Tilman captured him single-handedly in Arkansas, and he captured him in a bathhouse, a steam room type bathhouse, and they wrestled for the guns and so forth, and he overpowered him, and he brought him back on a train, and he never got the $5,000 reward, because several months later, and I've been to the jail, it's still there. It's not a jail, but the building's still there. Excuse me. Bill Doolin, who, by the way, I'm sure you know this, Bill Doolin was Desperado in the Eagles song. And Don't Wade Too Deep, Bitter Creek was Bitter Creek Newcomb, one of the guys in the Oklahoma Hombres gang the Doolin Dalton gang. But he escaped, and he was later killed by Heck Thomas, whose words were, "He was shooting at us, and I finally unlimbered old number 10 and got him." Number 10 was a double-barrel shotgun, and so that happened. But when he escaped, and I've never read this anywhere other than the research, they spread it around town by telephone in 1896. And when Heck Thomas's young second wife got the call, she said, "Oh my gosh, I better hide his guns." So she went out and buried them in the backyard, and Heck got back to find most of his prized firearms rusty from being buried in the dirt. And I've never read that in a Western novel, and it probably doesn't belong in one, but it happened.
Oh, it's an amusing anecdote one way or the other, depending upon what you're doing for the story. It's very good for that. So you've been doing all of this research and just really digging in deep onto everything here. what are some things about the West that people generally have gotten wrong due to movies, TV, and just not people necessarily putting everything into research they could in books?
Well, that's wow. Have we got a couple of hours?
Yeah,
I'll get high spots for you. Suspenders. Yeah, we see cowboys wearing Levi 501 jeans, just like kids do today. I've got some. They didn't have belt loops until 1922. Men didn't wear belts for anything other than holding guns up. They wore braces or suspenders. And you don't see that much in most Western TV shows and most Western movies, but that's the way they held the pants up. The pants generally didn't have pockets. If they did, they weren't much. But men also wore vests or waistcoats. Why'd they wear that? Well, certainly for warmth, but they wore them also because they had generally 4 pockets. So they could keep their penknife, they could keep their makings for their cigarettes, they could keep their watch if they had one in the pockets of their vest instead of their pants. By the way, there were several people who in the 1880s were killed in gunfights because they went to draw their gun and got the gun snagged in where their suspenders hooked on to their pants. And that must have been embarrassing to die that way, but it happened. Stetson hats. Stetson hats, a halfway decent one cost $10 in the 1870s and 80s. That's half a month's salary for a cowpuncher. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to try to not say cowboy in here, Kevin, because I'm writing a Western right now, tracking, or part of a 3-book series, tracking down the cowboy gang. And that's the ones that the Earps dealt with in Tombstone. And so people call cowmen, cowboys, cowpunchers, wranglers, whatever. So, but they only made about $20 a month, most of them. And so that hat, a lot of them bought cheap hats that looked like the devil when they got wet, and when they fed the horses water out of them and used them to stir up the campfire and so forth. Shirts generally had removable collars. If they had a collar, they were flannel plaid shirts or things like that. But most men, including cowboys, wore suits, wore dress pants like woolen slacks on cattle drives and so forth, not jeans. In town, most men wore suits and a lot of derby hats. So it wasn't just Bat Masterson. By the way, Bat Masterson, I've got a lot of him in this new series of books because he's, to me, one of the most intriguing of the lawmen. He was kind of a Renaissance guy. He's the only one I know of who special ordered every single one of his Colt revolvers from Colt with a special taller front sight. And I've got pictures of some of his. I've never held one, but he was quite a guy, and he's in definitely in the book tracking down the Marshall. First, the Marshall book that I've got for is Marshall of Jerome, and then in tracking down the writing down the cowboy gang. Most men wore something around their necks. Even if they didn't have a collar on their shirts because they didn't hook the collar on because it was a separate thing. They wore a bandana tied, a bow, which looked a little silly, but they did it. They wore a cravat or a string tie of some sort, but they usually had something around their necks. Grammar, it's kind of a pet peeve for me in the movies. Because you'd think all Westerners talk like somebody from the farthest cave back in Appalachia, and they didn't. They were from everywhere. They were from foreign countries. They were Irish. They were German. They were from different parts of the United States. And I have a fear that some of those one-room schoolhouses taught better grammar, certainly better penmanship, than a lot of our schools do now. These people spoke pretty well. They may have a different accent, but I don't use dialect almost ever in any book that I write. And that's the reason for it, because one, it's hard to read dialect, I think, when you're trying to read a novel, but two, what dialect did they really use? It depends on where he's from. What else? Cursing. I'll occasionally use some curse words, but men generally did not curse in front of ladies. And so ladies didn't go to eat alone generally. They certainly didn't go into bar rooms. And some of the nice places in Prescott, Arizona, had a separate entrance to the restaurant. Most people entered it through the bar, but they had a separate ladies' entrance so they could go in and be ladylike and not have to traipse through the bar. Food. Man, those people, they didn't have the camping trail foods that you and I have. And they ate jerky. They had stale sandwiches they could take, meat that was smoked, but most of it they had to cook. They would take a side of bacon with them. And think about the fact that they lived on bacon and beans. They couldn't make beans. You have to boil them for hours. They couldn't make beans unless they were camping in one place for a couple of days. So eating on the trail was not a pleasant thing. A lot of my books take place in high mountain desert, and they can't even find firewood. The only thing you can burn in country like that is juniper, which is like one big plant that grows across the landscape, and it's got little sapling things that you can cut off and make fire. So you can make your coffee, but you can't.
Burns up in a couple seconds, typically.
Yeah, things like that. Handguns. Let me warn you, I'm gonna hold up a handgun. I will not point it at you, even though you're probably 3,000 miles away. But this is what we think of when we think of cowboys. Now, this is a longer 7.5-inch barrel. It's a 45, and the Colt 45 came out in 1873. Unless one was stolen, this civilian public didn't get them until the mid 1870s because they all went to the army, and lost a bunch of them at Battle of the Little Bighorn. So these things cost about $20. That means they cost a month's pay. And I did a real study for a little magazine that's now defunct. I used to be the Western history editor of it. But 25 years ago, I did a study. What did the cowboys look like? What kind of guns they carried? They carried everything. They carried what they could afford. They carried Civil War cap and ball guns into the 1900s because that's all they could afford, and they worked. So very few of them wore holsters. If you notice quite correctly in Tombstone, the Earps drew from their pockets, from their coat pockets. Most people carried guns in their pocket. Cowboys on the trail carried the handguns in their saddlebags usually. And I wouldn't want to ride a horse while I'm trying to herd cattle with a 6-shooter tucked in a holster that could fall out and shoot me or the horse. And they only loaded, if it's a 6-shooter, they only loaded 5, and they carried it on an empty chamber, because if you drop it and it's on a full chamber and the hammer hits the ground, it goes bang. And that's never good.
Not on a horse.
Yes, that's some of the guys actually would take that empty cylinder and roll up a $20 bill in it to bury them if they got killed. And so that's one of the things that the sheriffs or the undertakers would look at, and look at the gun first and see if they got a funeral or not. And but those are the things. They some of them, the lucky ones carried Colts. The real lucky ones carried the Merwin and Halberts, which nobody knows what they are except very few people. And I love it when I read an author and he said, and he pulled out his Merwin and Halbert. I said, yes, this guy knows something. It was like a Rolex watch. But most of them carry what I call Maypops. It was a $1.50 gun from Sears and Roebuck, and it may pop when you squeeze the trigger, it may not. And so They are the big differences I see between reality and TV and movies. So I took that longer than you probably wanted me to, but I
Oh,
got,
fascinating.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, no reason to apologize for that. When you go about trying to start on a book, do you start with a character in mind or do you start with a plot in mind?
A character, usually. Not always, but usually a character. And then I figure, well, where am I going to put him? And then I figure out a theme, and it just kind of rolls from there. And people say, well, how do you end a book? I don't. The character ends the book. I let the character and play out and determine how the book ends.
So you don't
Uh,
necessarily outline the entire story as you're doing it.
I've never done an outline on a book in my life. And as you said, I've written 28 books, and I've written a lot more, not a lot more than that. I've written 10 books that are classified manuals and documents for the government. And I didn't outline those either. It's not the way my brain works.
Mhm.
And I see people with 3x5, 4x6 cards and long outlines. God bless them. Uh, they're going to be organized, but I just can't do it. I'm a storyteller, and if I were sitting, you and I were sitting there in front of a campfire drinking coffee or whatever we might be drinking, you'd say, Wayne, tell me a story about the West. That's the way I write a book, and it probably makes me much less of an author, and I don't really consider myself. I'm just a storyteller, and I put some of it down in a computer. So one,
That's the important part.
you hinted at something, and if I'm taking you off in a different direction or wrong direction, catch me on this,
Oh,
please.
no.
You talked about my colorful, that's one way to describe it, background. Um, how might that play into this? Well, it plays pretty obviously into the thrillers. I mean, I was a private investigator, I was a deputy sheriff, I worked for the FBI for 11 years. That's a lot of stuff. A lot of people did that. But I've been blessed in having friends and experiences that I think relate to any time period if you're writing an adventure. And I'll give you a couple of examples and kind of do a wink or something if I get going too long on this, please. From my own standpoint, and most of this was as a security contractor, some as a private investigator. I tracked a bank robber alone through the woods in a snowstorm for about 2 miles and got to where his car had been parked and he was gone. And I was 2 miles from my car by that time. But I know the feeling, what it's like, what Heck Thomas, who's probably, he and Bass Reeves, the African American Deputy U.S. Marshal, were probably the two greatest man trackers of all times. I kind of got a feel for what they must have felt. Hey, I think this is one guy from the tracks, but is he going to meet up with 6 guys with machine guns? I'm tracking him with one pistol, and my cell phone doesn't work, and I don't have a radio. And so I know that feeling. Well, if I can bring that feeling back and put it in a book, I think it makes it more believable.
Very
So
visible, yes.
The other blessing, not that I was in a gunfight, I was in a one-on-one gunfight from 7 feet apart. And I don't talk about that much, and I won't do it here other than to say, I know how quick it is, and I know how you feel afterwards. And so I try to portray that in the books. Friends, and you would think, well, how do these friends have anything to do with Westerns? One of my early mentors, Scotty, parachuted as an OSS agent into occupied France to fight the Nazis with the 12 guys that were the French Maquis underground. It was more than 12, but not many people. And he told me great stories, how lonely it was, how terrifying it was. One guy or 5 guys, as the case may be, depending on who's with him, against an entire brigade of Nazis, well-trained, well-armed soldiers. The other guy, my very best friend and mentor, also died. Was a special ops guy that went into, during Vietnam, went into Cambodia and Laos. I tried to make it one country. By himself. I mean, he was dropped off, but he went in and went through the jungle or whatever by himself to kill or capture high-value Viet Cong officers. I mean, that's Bass Reeves stuff. He might have had more modern guns, and it might not have been Oklahoma or Texas or Nevada, but that's Bass Reeves and Heck Thomas stuff. One guy going into hostile territory to bring back or take down another guy. Yeah. And tell me about it. How did you feel? How did you eat? How did you sleep? How did you, what would you plan? How did you exfiltrate, or how did you get out? Well, he had helicopters. Those guys didn't. They had the horse they rode in on if they were lucky. I knew 2 of the deputy U.S. Marshals in the gunfight at Ruby Ridge. One of them I knew pretty well, and he kind of told me what it was like. This was in way in the boonies, shooting it out. Right, was it a rightful act? History will determine that. I don't really have an opinion on it, but I know what he told me he felt like. So I think all of these things I've been blessed with, because I think I can convert these feelings, these gut feelings, into a book. And if I don't do it, bad on me, because I've got the opportunity to do it. Anyway, I'm off that.
Oh, very good. Where can people learn more about your books, buy your books, and basically more about you, the non-classified parts?
Okay, the books are all on Amazon. The newest book that just came out, you mentioned, Captive Matter, and that is a mystery thriller. And it's about a guy who's a security contractor. Funny thing about that, a security contractor. And he's living the Margaritaville life. He's living in Key West, and he gets a call. And the biggest warning in any of my modern books is, and then the phone rang. And it's a friend of his from the intelligence community said, hey, this is unofficial, but it's not an unofficial matter, it's a captive matter, hence the title. And this guy is an illegal arms trader in France, and he's got a trophy wife who's disappeared in the mountains of Idaho. He wants somebody to go get him, and I told him you'd call him. And that's where the thing begins. And there's a great cover that you all did with a guy holding a automatic weapon and another guy riding a snowmobile, and that's one of the scenes from the book. But he has to determine whether or not the captive is a captive. She's suffering from Stockholm syndrome, where she's now associated herself with her captors, or is she a conspirator? And he has to find that out. And either way, he has to extract her from wherever he is. He ends up following her halfway across the world. And then once he catches her, she becomes a bigger liability to the people that kidnapped her, because she can testify against them. And so they go the other half almost around the world. And I think it's one of the best books I've ever written. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud that DS has published it.
We're very proud to have you on board with us. Definitely appreciate all of that. We're about out of time here for the day, so I definitely appreciate you taking the time on all of this and being able to come along here.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I think that all of the stuff, the West, it's very important to keep that alive. That's part of our heritage, and we're losing more and more heritage every day to electronic media and social media and so forth. And this is one way to keep just a little bit of it, Kevin. So thank you for letting me come on your show, and I wish you the best, and certainly Dusty Saddles, DS Publishing, the best. Great bunch of people.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much, Wayne Tilman.